Right, so welcome colleagues to this evening's Sarah's seminar presentation. So tonight we've got Claire Fox. She's a reader in educational psychology at MMU, and Charlotte Bagnall, who's a lecturer in educational psychology at the University of Manchester. And so tonight they're going to kind of between the two of them do a presentation to the title of Primary Secondary School Transition under COVID-19, exploring the perceptions and experiences of children, parents, guardians and teachers. So following usual protocol for this, so in a second I'll hand over to the speakers and they're going to speak for kind of between 30 and 40 minutes. And then after that, we'll open up the session for questions and discussion. So it is recorded, and normally we record the entire session, but I will send, I always send a copy of the recorded session to speakers, to kind of give them, get permission from them to publish it before I actually make it live on the website. So without further ado, so I'll hand over to Claire and Charlotte.
Great, thanks Craig, and thank you for inviting us. So Charlotte and I are going to talk about our study that aimed to look at primary to secondary school transition under COVID-19, and it involved exploring the perceptions and experiences of children, parents, guardians and teachers. And we conducted this study with Yvonne Skipper at the University of Glasgow. I was invited to give this seminar by Dave Putwain. I think you saw my presentation at the Psychology of Education section conference last September. And as we got close to this date, I suddenly sort of realised that actually I didn't have any more material other than this paper, and obviously wanted to make sure that there was enough to sort of fill 45 minutes. So I spoke to Charlotte about my dilemma, and it was Charlotte's PhD research that really was a precursor to this study that looked at primary to secondary school transition under COVID-19. And Charlotte very kindly said, well, I could deliver the seminar with you, let's do it together. And so I gladly accepted that offer. So thank you, Charlotte. So just to give you a bit of a brief introduction to the topic of school transition, it is recognised that it is a major life event whereby children face many changes. So in England, it happens at the age of 11, and as well as making this transition from primary to secondary school, often children are going through puberty and they're having to navigate national assessment tests, so they're taking their SATs as well. So there's a lot going on, there's lots of different stresses for them. And I think it's important to recognise that there are individual differences. So this quote sums it up quite well. Transitional periods in the lives of children and young people are times of threat, but also opportunities for change. So for a lot of children, they settle in quite easily, they make new friends, they get used to new teachers, a different teaching style, different subjects. But for a significant minority of children, it will be a time of threat and they will struggle, especially if they don't have an adult supportive figure and if they're lacking certain coping skills. And obviously we make lots of different transitions in our lives, and also there are lots of different transitions within education. But I think it's widely understood that primary to secondary school transition is probably one of the most difficult transitions in pupils' educational careers. And I think that's why Charlotte and I and Yvonne are interested in looking at school transition and thinking about ways that we can make it better for children. So how can we better support children during this period of time? So what we're going to cover is, I'm going to pass over to Charlotte in just a moment, and Charlotte is going to talk about her PhD research. She had 4 studies, 3 preliminary studies, the UK focus group study, the US case study, and the UK special school case study. And all of these 3 preliminary studies, she used the findings to develop an emotional centred intervention for children that was developed by teachers. And she evaluated this intervention in her 4th study, known as the intervention study. So Charlotte's going to then pass back to me, and I'll talk about the study, the title of the seminar, which is looking at primary secondary school transition during the pandemic, so under COVID-19. So over to you, Charlotte.
Okay then. So again, thank you for sort of having us, but I thought I'd start the presentation with providing a little bit of a rationale really for why we decided to look at children's emotional wellbeing. Obviously, it's recognised that the number of young people experiencing mental health difficulties is increasing rapidly, and this is especially between the ages of 11 and 14, which is when cross-culturally most children are negotiating a school transition. And as we know, these mental health difficulties have been shown to heighten during the pandemic, which Claire will explore a little bit later on. However, efforts to improve primary to secondary school transition are minimal, and this is subject to limitations at both the school level, but also at the methodological level. So in terms of school level transition limitations, one of the common findings that's often shown in the literature is transition preparations are often delayed because of national assessments. And this is often subject to fears of behavioural problems and internalising problems interfering with this high stakes period of time. As if children don't respond too well to discussions around school transition, the implications on these other factors is often considered. And then even when transition preparations are delivered within school, there's often a focus on the school the child is transitioning to, as opposed to general skills to help prepare children for the challenges they're going to experience when they transition to secondary school. And also a lot of school-centred work, but also empirical work is focused on academic attainment and social adjustment, as opposed to children's emotional well-being. And also at the methodological level, limitations include small-scale designs, which don't take into account multiple assessment periods, which is recognised as really important when we're looking at school transition, as it is a longitudinal process. So we need to be investigating transition over a longer period of time. And therefore, the rationale, or I suppose the aim of my PhD, was to bring school transition intervention research to scale in real-world settings by designing and implementing a 5-week emotional-centred support intervention. And this intervention was called Talking About School Transition, or TAST for short. And we've included on the left-hand side of the slide our TAST logo that we created to go alongside the intervention. And that's my research question at the bottom of the screen. So can students' emotional wellbeing over primary to secondary school transition be improved through targeted emotional-centred intervention? Next slide. Oh, yeah. My PhD intervention was informed by 3 preliminary research studies, which Claire's explained. So we conducted focus groups and case study research in both the UK and the USA in mainstream and special schools. And this informed the design, the delivery and the evaluation of TAST. TAST was also informed by previous research, and also it was underpinned by resilience theory as well. Okay, so for my first preliminary research study, I wanted to examine students, parents and teachers' experiences of school transition and how they felt it could be improved. As to date, there's been very limited research which has investigated primary to secondary school transition retrospectively from the perspective of these 3 key stakeholders. And to do this, I conducted 3 asynchronous online focus groups with parents and teachers. So these focus groups were conducted online, and we used focus group IT to conduct these online focus groups, which I would argue is probably one of the strengths of this design, as it enabled parents and teachers to contribute to the discussions at a time that was convenient with them. So we had our discussion questions online, and parents and teachers could respond to the questions and each other's responses at a time that was convenient with them. And we also conducted 5 face-to-face focus groups with Year 7 students. So it's worth noting that Year 7 students and also their parents were reflecting on their retrospective experiences of the transition. So the focus groups took part sort of midway through Year 7. So they're reflecting on the preparations in Year 6, but also those early preparations in Year 7. And we analysed the findings using inductive thematic analysis. And we took a data-driven approach. So it was found that in order to improve this period, there needs to be greater communication across systems, so between primary schools and secondary schools, but also stakeholders, so between the school and the home. This research also made a unique contribution to the field in primary to secondary school transition, as it demonstrated the dangers of too much but also too little transition exposure. Too much causing year 7 children to feel overwhelmed and anxious, but also too little, meaning that children not really quite sure about what they're about to face, so they felt underprepared. So there was acknowledgement that school transition preparation should follow a continuum in line with children's needs. It was also recognised that social networks change over primary to secondary school transition, peer support being especially crucial for children, yet it was often misunderstood by adults. And it was also recognised that seeking support from adults is harder at secondary school. So these findings inform the design and the delivery of tasks. And one of the recommendations pertaining to the need for gradual and sensitive transition exposure, providing both exposure but also consistency, was modelled through the tasked intervention that was delivered gradually. The collaborative support between the home and the school. And an example is a puzzler activity. So in class, children were asked to come up with a couple of questions that they'd like to ask their parents when they go home related to school transition. And then the child brought the puzzle home and asked their parents the questions, wrote their answers down, then brought it back to school. And this was to help facilitate that collaborative support. And there are also strategies for children to continue to access teacher support and also foster peer support when they move to secondary school. Okay, so we'll move on to the next preliminary research study now, which was a case study conducted in the USA. So research has shown that children who are older or have navigated a previous school transition find it easier. And this is often because when transition timing is delayed, children have more time to develop skills that they need in preparation for the transition. However, these two ideas are in conflict, particularly when we think about 3-tier school transition systems. As within 3-tier systems, the first transition children make is likely to be a lot sooner. Whereas the second transition, the children will be able to draw on the skills they've learned from that first transition. But it's likely that that first transition would be harder because the child is making it at a young age. But the second transition likely to be easier, as they're not only building on the skills they've developed from that first transition, but they're also older making it. So therefore, it's quite unclear really which school transition is best for children and the optimal time for children to make a school transition. So we conducted case study and focus group research in the USA to investigate how this period is navigated across different transition systems. And we decided to select schools within the USA as they both have 2- and 3-tier systems, but also early and delayed onset times. So in line with the 2-tier system, children can make just the one transition at age 14 to high school. So they transition from elementary school to high school. Within the 3-tier transition system, children can make a transition prior to that. So they can make a transition to middle school at age 11, which is synonymous with the age in which children transition to secondary school in the UK. But they can also make a transition to junior high school at age 12. So by investigating transitions in the US, we're able to compare different onset times, so 11 versus 12 versus 14, but also whether it's easier making just the one transition or making two. So again, we analysed our findings using inductive thematic analysis. And what was shown was that the earlier the child made the transition, the harder it was perceived to be. So when a child made a transition at age 11 or 12, they found it a lot harder than when they made the transition at age 14. But what was particularly interesting was that we did see some differences between the 11-year-olds and the 12-year-olds, which were particularly picked up by the school teachers, who said that when the child made a transition at age 11 as opposed to 12, they lacked sort of emotional readiness for the transition in comparison to the 12-year-olds, which we could argue suggested that the extra year can make a huge difference. And that may be because this time coincides with puberty. There was also a lot of focus in the US on school transition being presented as a progression as opposed to a loss. So there weren't the leaving ceremonies we often have in the UK. Instead, it was discussed as sort of a celebration. We're moving on to the next chapter. And there was a lot of particularly displays around the school on the importance of this progression the child was about to make. But there were differences between the stakeholders in terms of which transition system they preferred, like a 2-tier or a 3-tier. So in particular, parents and teachers expressed the importance of consistency, particularly during these elemental middle school years, and they preferred one transition because of this. In comparison, children found high school transition a lot easier if they navigated a previous transition. So if they transitioned to middle school or junior high school prior to the move to high school. And again, some recommendations for tasks which were informed by the case study research was firstly that focus was placed on transition being presented as a progression as opposed to a loss within the task lessons. So there was an activity which asked the child to reflect on a previous transition they may have made, so moving house, and the transferable skills they've gained from that, which they can then translate to their transition to secondary school. Okay, can I have the next slide, please? So the final preliminary research study we conducted was a UK special school case study. So I wanted to examine how children with pre-existing emotional problems cope with the added apprehension and anxiety that comes with school transition and how they're supported, as this has implications in how we can support children within mainstream schools who often experience the same anxieties and apprehension around primary to secondary school transition, but they may simply display it in a different way. And this study also drew on the fact that we do have a limited understanding of children's emotional experiences of primary to secondary school transition. So we wanted to specifically investigate emotional experiences in more detail. So we used a similar case study and focus group design. It was exploratory and explanatory, and we used various different methodologies. So we used photo elicitation focus groups, and these were conducted with Year 6 children. And our decision to conduct photo elicitation focus groups was partly due to the additional sensitivities in that we were conducting this research within a special school with children who experience social, emotional, mental health difficulties. So it gave the children a lot more ownership in terms of what was discussed within the focus groups, as the child was given a camera a few weeks before the focus group to take a picture of 10 things that represented how they felt towards the transition. Then they brought these pictures to the focus group and we discussed it as part of the discussions. So the children had a lot more ownership in terms of what was brought up, but it was also reflected of the additional needs of our sample. We also conducted some interviews, document analysis, and we also conducted some questionnaires as well. So we mainly, again, used inductive thematic analysis, taking a data-driven approach. And what was shown was the importance of nurturing children's short-term emotional well-being, but also providing them with the confidence and self-assurance to feel ready and prepared to move on when they move to secondary school. And to do this, children need to feel a sense of safety and belonging at both primary schools, but also secondary schools. And these findings inform the sensitive, progressive structure of the task lessons to help children feel safe and supportive while engaging in discussions and activities which aim to develop their coping skills in preparation for the transition to secondary school. So one of the activities we had was a challenge solution worksheet where the child came up with a couple of challenges they may experience when they moved to secondary school, but then how to translate this challenge into a solution to help them feel ready and prepared for the move they're about to make. So together, this insight informed the design, delivery, and the evaluation of TAST. And TAST was a bottom-up intervention, so it was informed by our own previous research, but also other research within the field and theory. And the intervention was delivered on a universal whole class basis, and it was flexible to fit within the PSHE curriculum. The intervention was teacher-led, which overcomes some of the limitations of previous standalone interventions, which are delivered by external professionals. Okay, so on this slide, I just wanted to provide a bit of a breakdown of the transition sessions making up the TAST intervention. So the first week focused on repositioning the transition as a progression as opposed to a loss. And this was done to help children to reflect on the similarities, but also the differences between primary school and secondary school, and potential challenges they may experience and how to translate these into solutions. The second session focused on building the children's coping skills and resilience in preparation for the transition by helping the children to reflect on differences they may experience. Week 3 focused on social support, how social networks may change when they transition to secondary school, and also to set realistic expectations of what this will be like, but also how they can continue to access support from these figures when they do transition to secondary school. And then the final 2 weeks drew on Bolton's cross-age teaching techniques. So this was where the children translate their learning from the previous 3 sessions into practice by developing 5 top tips using a medium of their choice to present their tips to a Year 5 audience. And they could do this using posters, leaflets, storyboards. A few children came up with poems and raps as well. But the aim of this was to help the children sort of translate their learning and be able to apply this within, I suppose, context by presenting it to a younger audience. And I've included on this slide also the workbook that children worked on during the intervention, but also the series of lesson plans that the teachers had. So there was PowerPoint slides and also a lesson plan pack that teachers had to deliver the task intervention. Okay, so to evaluate the efficacy of TAST, we had 4 primary schools which took part in the intervention, and we had 4 primary schools which participated as control schools, and all completed a questionnaire which assessed their social adjustment. So this was assessed in terms of the peer problems subscale on the SDQ, but also assessed their emotional adjustment. And this was assessed using the emotional symptoms subscale on the SDQ, but also transition worries using the transition worries scale. We also examined children's coping efficacy, so their belief in being able to cope when they transition to secondary school. And this was an explanatory outcome variable, so it was used to examine change. So we aimed to improve children's coping efficacy in order to improve their adjustment during this period. To assess the fidelity of the intervention, what we did was we asked Year 6 teachers which assessed how well they thought the intervention went down, how many sessions were delivered, and a few more questions which sort of, asked about the process of delivering the programme, what they felt was strengths of the programme, limitations also, and how it could be improved. And the project had a longitudinal follow-up design. So this included both pre and post test responses, but also we had a delayed post test as well into the transition, which I think will make a lot more sense when we see the next slide, as it sort of shows the 4 time points. So the first time point, children completed the survey just before they participated in TAST. They then completed it again once the TAST sessions had finished, just before the child made the transition to secondary school. And then we had 2 delayed post tests. So the first was in September when the children just moved to secondary school. And the second delayed post test was at Christmas within secondary school. And by examining sort of time 3 and time 4, so this delayed post test enabled us to examine this notion of a temporary honeymoon period children often experience when they move to secondary school. So they see the new secondary school environment through rose-colored glasses, meaning that we don't really fully see adjustment until the dust begins to settle, I suppose, and children sort of towards sort of the midpoint of Year 7. So we wanted to be able to capture that in our design. Okay, so what did we find? So for both groups, there was a significant decrease in transition worries between time 1 and time 4. And this, you would argue, is expected over the transition period. There was no significant differences between the intervention and the control condition immediately following the intervention between time 1 and 2. And this was speculated due to the limited time between these 2 time points. So the children were still in primary school, they just completed the TAST intervention. So we would argue that although the children had all of these skills to translate when they transitioned to secondary school, they didn't really have a chance to test them yet, as they hadn't made that transition to secondary school. And there was a significant reduction in transition worries from time 1 to post-transition between the intervention and the control group. So in other words, while transition worries decreased for both groups over the transition period, this decrease was larger for children in the intervention condition post-transition, in comparison to the control condition.
Thank you, Charlotte. So I'm going to talk about our COVID-19 study now. So bearing in mind all of Charlotte's PhD research, obviously the focus on emotional well-being, us knowing, that it's a very significant period of time. When the pandemic hit in March 2020, we knew that it would be a challenging time for these children. So obviously they're negotiating two major life events, so primary secondary school transition and also COVID-19. And so what we wanted to do was to do a piece of research. We were actually unsuccessful. We applied to the BA COVID fund, but we decided to do it anyway, didn't we? We did it unfunded. And we wanted to try to collect some data and then turn around the findings really quickly to try to sort of feed into this period of time to so that teachers and parents and the children themselves could actually know how to sort of better make the transition under COVID-19. So obviously it was unprecedented. Key empirical and practical gaps on how to support children during this time. We didn't manage to sort of turn around the findings as quickly as we liked, did we, Charlotte? We were having to cope with online teaching and doing this research unfunded. But as you'll see, we were able to feed in some findings to support children during the transition in 2021. But as well as trying to sort of get some knowledge to how to support children during this period of time, we were thinking that we could actually get some learning in terms of how we can better support children during transition to feed forward to the new normal. So how can we actually do things differently? Often we can learn about how to do things better when we're faced with challenging circumstances. So we decided to conduct a series of online surveys. So there was one for children, one for parents and guardians, and one for Year 6 and Year 7 teachers. There were a mix of open and closed questions, and all of the questions were focused on their perceptions and experiences of navigating primary to secondary school transition. We have actually got the paper accepted, so it's now published in the British Journal of Educational Psychology, which is fantastic news. As you can imagine, we had a large amount of data, so quantitative data and qualitative data. And in that paper, we bring together the quantitative and qualitative data. But just for this presentation, I'm going to focus on the qualitative data. So that's the data from the open-ended questions. And to analyse this data, we used an approach called thematic framework analysis, which I don't know if anybody's come across this technique, and it was new to us. Obviously, we're familiar with thematic analysis and Brown and Clark's 6 steps. But thematic framework analysis is quite good when you've got data that is quite shallow. So obviously, when you present open-ended questions on a survey, you get a sentence or two if you're lucky. So you do get some sort of qualitative data, but it's not particularly in depth. We didn't want to just resort to a content analysis. We wanted to still preserve some of the complexity and nuances in the data. And so we use this approach. It's very good when you have got a large amount of shallow data that you want to pull together. And it worked for us because we were trying to pull together across the 3 different stakeholders. So the children, the parents and teachers. And what's also good about it is it enables you to address a priori issues and also emergent themes. So obviously, reflexive thematic analysis is very much often data driven, it's very inductive, but there are also things that we wanted to know from the data, very much guided by the questions we asked. So you can see the framework categories we've got there. So the impact on the transition, there's a separate one for the emotional impact. We wanted to know about what happened before and what happened afterwards. And we wanted to know from the 3 stakeholders what worked, what could have been done differently. So what I'm going to do now is take each framework category in turn and talk you through the qualitative findings. So the first framework category is the impact on the transition. So there were a lot of responses about the environment being different. So when the children went up to secondary school, it wasn't a sort of normal secondary school experience. So children were being taught in small bubbles with the same group of children, often in the same room with the same teacher. So you can see a quote from the parent there that actually the situation, the circumstances, the building, it was all very similar to what they'd experienced at primary school. The children also recognised this too. So there were responses about the restrictions in being taught in a small bubble and not actually being able to make new friends. So making friends within their bubble, but not necessarily having the same opportunities to extend their friendship networks. And also the teachers talked about the environment being different for them too. So not being able to satellite around the class and hover over the children, not being able to teach in the way they wanted to. I think the key thing that we got in terms of the impact on transition was absence. So things that were missing or things that didn't happen. So there were missed academic opportunities. So some parents, some children saw this as a missed opportunity. I'm sure some children were quite happy they didn't have to take SATs. Missed relational opportunities, so not being able to say the proper goodbyes. Missed emotional and personal opportunities, so not having the end of year residential, the leavers assembly, the prom. And also transition preparations didn't happen, or they were very much diluted. So no visits up to the secondary school, and a lot of that classroom work that would take place, that would typically focus on more of the practicalities rather than the emotional side, didn't really happen. Because of course, children were being taught online. Year 6 children did go back, I think, for perhaps about 4 or 5 weeks in June and July. But the focus then for teachers was actually getting them to catch up. So numeracy and literacy. So a lot of these transition preparations didn't happen. Also, the children were different. So the teachers are talking about when the year 7s came up under COVID-19, they were lacking in confidence and their motivation and engagement had slipped. The next category is emotional impact, and we decided to have this as a separate category because it was so significant. So the children, there were lots of responses about feelings of loss and sadness. And this is really linked to those missed opportunities that I talked about on the previous slide. Feelings of stress and anxiety, obviously it is a very uncertain period of time for children, but without those visits up to schools, as you can see from the quote from the parent there, them actually not being able to sort of visit, it means that they're perhaps overthinking things and not able to really anticipate or expect what's coming up. There were a lot of responses from the teachers about their mental health, so feeling overwhelmed and exhausted, feeling very uncertain because of the changing government guidance, and also feeling worried for the children in the here and now, so the impact on their education, but also their future life chances. The teachers, there were lots of comments also about feelings of anger, as you might expect. So the teachers were having a very difficult time having to cope with all the changing government guidance. And there are also comments about it being very difficult to cope with the wider negative media reporting. And obviously when they were trying to do the best that they could, it's quite hard to cope with that too. I just wanted to present some of the quantitative data there very quickly. So we did have some questions for the children about how optimistic they felt before they made the transition. And I think these statistics show very well that there are clearly individual differences. So you can see that there are 24% said a lot of the time, 44% some of the time, and you've got a significant number of children who are saying they felt optimistic none of the time or rarely. So those are the children that I guess we really need to worry about. So what happened pre-transition? So things had to be done differently. And so because you couldn't do things normally, schools had to actually do things in a very, very different way. Some schools stepped up and were quite innovative, whereas some schools didn't. So relational support, obviously not the same opportunities to visit the school, visit the new teachers, visit other children who might be going up to other schools. Some schools were able to overcome some of these difficulties by, for example, making a video of the teachers and having online summer schools. Sharing information, so some schools seem to do this very badly and just sent lots and lots of letters home, whereas some schools were thinking a bit more innovatively and creatively about how they could impart the information to the parents and children without actually being able to have that parents' evening that they'd normally have. Practical support was there from the parents as normal, so buying the new uniform, buying the new kit, helping them get their bag prepared, perhaps doing the walk to school. And actually in some schools, transition preparations did take place. So although obviously the priority when the children came back into class was numeracy and literacy, some schools were able to spend some of the time in class getting them thinking about how they could be prepared in a practical way. And some of the schools were able to go further and actually provide this sort of emotional support through the classroom and also on a one-to-one basis. And this was very much appreciated, certainly by the parents. And also the children talked about the emotional support they got from their peers and their parents before they made the transition. So what happened post-transition? Again, very similar. Secondary schools recognised that they had to do things very, very differently because they were getting children coming up and they'd actually missed out on a lot of their education. So some of the teachers, there were some responses about how they almost abandoned the national curriculum in the first few months. So really focused on numeracy and literacy. And also the children, there were some responses about how they'd actually drawn a lot of support from their peers once again in helping them with certain subjects. Relational support, so schools obviously with the Year 7 children when they come up, there is an attention and that there is an understanding, there is some sort of hand-holding, but I think under Covid-19 this was really stepped up and there was even more hand-holding for a few months and perhaps even beyond. So teachers talked about really focusing on helping the children to settle in, make new friends and develop those relationships with teachers. And the teachers also talked about really reaching out to develop those relationships with parents. Practical school support, so the teachers again were much more understanding than perhaps they would be ordinarily. So I think very quickly, normally students are expected to become quite independent and teachers might become a bit more less tolerant if children get lost and if they're not coming with the full kit. But you can see there that the secondary school teachers were much more understanding of that during COVID-19. And again, emotional support, which was really good for us to see, wasn't it, Charlotte? Because we've always recognised that there needs to be a greater emphasis on emotional support as well as helping children to deal with the practical side. So there was much more form time and much greater emphasis on pastoral support to enable that emotional support to happen. Finally, the last framework category is looking ahead and lessons learned. And I'm not expecting you to look at all of this. I know it's very small font. This wouldn't be a great slide from a teaching perspective, but this is to sort of show you our infographic, and I'll show you the full infographic on the next slide. But this is how we wanted to sort of turn the findings around really quickly and feed them into the transition preparations in March 2021. And we really wanted to get from the three stakeholders, what worked well, what could have been done differently, and this sort of translated into advice for the children, teachers and parents. In a nutshell, the advice of the children, mainly from other children, was that it's good to talk. So to make sure that you talk to other children, parents and teachers about how you're feeling. The advice of the teachers, there were two main things. One was about the importance of the sort of gradual exposure to transition over Year 6, perhaps even earlier, because actually the fact that it was left right to the end of Year 6 was really problematic in 2020. So there just wasn't time for all of that to take place. And also recognition for the teachers that they need to recognise school transition as an important milestone that does need to be celebrated. So those celebrations that didn't happen were really, really missed. And then advice for parents was really about what they could do to support their children practically and emotionally, but also advice for parents about seeking support for themselves too, because it's obviously a stressful period of time for parents as well as children. So you can see the full infographic there, and we sent it out to a number of schools, didn't we, Charlotte, and also posted it on Twitter. So we like to think that we were able to get some of the findings to feed in. And I'll explain in a moment, we also managed to do a piece in The Conversation that was picked up by The Independent just before the children went back. So it's really hard, isn't it, sometimes to make sure we can sort of have that research impact, but we did what we could to try and feed in these recommendations. So the first one is obviously focusing on children's resilience and emotional well-being throughout primary school to support children to review school transition much more positively. So doing it gradually, building up the skills to help them to deal with that transition rather than leaving it right to the end of Year 6 when SATs are over. The second recommendation is that it is a significant milestone and it does need to be recognised and celebrated. But I think it needs to be balanced really, really carefully. I think if we can position it as a gradual progression without all that build up at the end, then children won't actually see it as a loss. And it can end up being a progression that can be celebrated without all of that hysteria and a lot of tears that you often see in our primary schools. Recommendation 3, so shared communication between parents and teachers is key to support transfer children, but perhaps a bit more thought is needed as to how to make that truly collaborative. And then 4, obviously in line with the government changes about addressing children's mental health in schools, we need to think about how we can develop this and do more of this in primary schools and obviously in secondary schools too. So it shouldn't necessarily just be something that happens at those key transition periods. And then finally, teachers need support too. So obviously there were a lot of comments from teachers who are feeling overwhelmed, exhausted, mental health suffering, feeling very angry. We know that teacher retention has been a problem for a very long time. Be interesting to see what's happening with teacher retention over the last 2 years. Obviously, it's a very, very stressful career, but if teachers are being expected to step up and support children's mental health, then they need to be mentally healthy too. So that brings me to the end of the presentation. I think we've made pretty good time, Charlotte. I want to thank obviously Yvonne, who was Charlotte's other PhD supervisor, and Jez Oldfield at Manchester Metropolitan University, who supported the supervision of the intervention study. You've got our email addresses there if you'd like to contact us. I've also put Charlotte's website there, where she's got all of the resources that she's mentioned as part of TAST, and they're freely available to download. And also here's the conversation piece that I mentioned. So we wrote a piece for the conversation about how parents can help children make the transition in September 2021, and it was picked up by The Independent. And there's our references. So thank you very much for listening, and Charlotte and I would be very keen to hear any questions you've got.
Yeah, great, excellent, many thanks for that. Yeah, really insightful. So you've kind of prompted a few questions for me, but I don't like kind of abusing my kind of privileges, Chair, so I like to open up to other people first. So any questions, comments from other colleagues?
I've got the same problem, Craig, in that I could rattle on for about half an hour. Can I just ask Andrea, you're on mute.
Yeah.
But can I just start off with just one question then, and then if there's any time, I'll get stuck into some really nitty-gritty ones. But Claire, Charlotte, absolutely fantastic studies, really, really, really good stuff, really interesting. And Claire, I'm going to pick your brains on that last framework you talked about at some point as well, because I also applied to the BA fund, didn't get funded, did it anyway, and I've got some fairly shallow, open-ended answers that I've not done anything with yet, so I'll talk to you about that at some point. But anyway, my question is, as I was listening, I've just finished reading a PhD that's on talking about the transition to sixth form, and whether the transition to sixth form should be considered a bona fide transition in its own right. Because it was interesting when you're talking about 2 and 3 tier systems transitions, and I was thinking, I wonder whether you'd see sixth form as a bona fide transition in that, because actually maybe not all of the issues that you flagged up, but I'd say about 70%, 75% of the same issues that you flagged up, especially in relation to loss versus gain, and you know, the sort of academic challenges that come out. Maybe the social a little bit less, but anyway, the extent to which you think that should also be considered a bona fide transition, and basically whether you could adapt many of the ideas that you've got and recommendations to a slightly older age group, because I think, as far as I can see, certainly when I spent an awful lot of time in sixth form, there was absolutely zero transition going on, which was a little bit, you know, this was 18 years ago. But
yeah, definitely. I think, yeah, some of the activities can definitely be translated into the transition from, I suppose, high school to sixth form. And I suppose some of the same challenges will be experienced. So the fact that, you know, friendship groups will be dismantled when children move to, well, the adults, aren't the young adults move to sixth form. Sometimes sixth forms can be attached to high schools, but sometimes they can be completely separate as well. So, you know, it could be that a student's making a transition all on their own to a specific sixth form that's specialising in particular skills they want to gain. So yeah, I definitely think it could be space for further research, looking at sort of activities to support that transition, definitely.
Yeah, I agree. I think when you were talking, Dave, I was sort of thinking, well, actually, if you're going from a school to a college, then yes. So my son left his, and he could have stayed on at the sixth form, he chose to go to a college. for many different reasons. And I suppose for him, it's like a different way of getting to school. You know, it's a new building, it's new people, as well as the academic challenges you mentioned. But I suppose the children who do stay on in school in the sixth form, they've still got that step up, haven't they, in terms of a different way and different expectations. They're expected to behave differently as well, I suppose, aren't they? And yeah, a lot of the activities could help, couldn't they? Because I think when children are older, as a parent, you sort of think they're quite independent, they just need to get on with it. But actually, they do still need support. So some of the activities that are trying to encourage that communication between the parents and the children, like, oh, what was it like for you when you left school? You know, just opening up those conversations can make quite a difference, can't it?
Definitely.
May I just add there, you know, sorry, just like Abigail, I just want to say, just like Abigail, I myself am sat here in my rather chilled out clothes, that's why my video is not on. I really enjoyed your talk, and I remember when I was in school / college, and I went to the college that was attached to my school, and I was thinking, even for me in that situation, like that was a massive jump. Even though I was still going to the same building, I was still making the same journey. I think there's a pressure once you reach a certain age of, oh, that's it, you know what you're doing now, and it's almost like an instantaneous thing. And I think that's, you know, you were talking before about supporting children emotionally, and I think that's something that really is missing in a lot of education settings. And so I think even at that stage, that should be more in place. Just from my own experience, but obviously it's not just me. There's a big need for that. So I think that would be marvelous if that was something that you could carry on as well.
Giving you more work to do, clearly.
It's nice to have ideas, isn't it? Perhaps Dave, you could work with us on that, because I know you're sort of interested in that sort of transition as well, aren't you? Sort of, I think you've done some research with students in FE, haven't you? Yeah,
I've done lots of studies with students in sixth form.
And I taught sixth form, and there were students who'd come to us for lots of reasons, and they did need that. I was obviously they had a year pastorally, you know, a lot of that was part of my role. But I think when they're in school, when they've come, you're very aware of it from somewhere else, and you support them. But that we kind of expect a lot from those who are just coming up. So that resonated. And the emotion side is really interesting to me. I'm here as sorry, I was late. I was desperate to get here, but I had to physically leave the house and go to a school meeting. But for me, I'm here as a secondary programme leader, and I just found it all fascinating, and I would love to share this with our cohort. I'm not programme, I've just given myself a promotion. I'm deputy programme leader. Sorry, but I just found it absolutely fascinating, and the emotional side of it, and what teachers have had to deal with emotionally when I've talked to teachers in schools really will chime. So I'll certainly be sharing this with our partnership. I think it's a really important piece of work that
your
schools
secret is safe with me, Andrea. I won't tell Minaj.
Yeah, Paul Camilla's just been demoted, and I've just promoted myself. But yeah,
very happy for you to use the recording. I think you've got our permission. I think that could be used then however you wish, you know, at your institution. So I'm sure students would benefit.
Well, we have a session coming up in May, and that's why I'm here, because I thought, you know, it's just, yeah, and I wish more of my colleagues had seen it, but the fact that that recording is available will be really, really useful. Just thought it was absolutely great.
Thank you. Thanks, Andrea.
Yeah.
So linking into that, because this is not my area, because I'm more kind of philosophy of education, but so it's really interesting to get this insight. And what kind of resonates for me is and sometimes in an uncomfortable way, but I'll explain what I mean by this, is the notion of resilience. Because listening to the kind of trauma experienced by teachers, I think it's unfortunate that it tends to be hijacked in quite a managerialist way by certain types of leaders who tend to have the kind of attitude of, well, you just need to be resilient. You need to develop resilience to deal with this.
Yeah.
Whereas the approach that you've taken with your research, I think flags up the fact that you can't just kind of use the word resilience. You have to facilitate resilience. Yeah, yeah. I just wonder, what are your thoughts on the notion of resilience in that sense?
Yeah, I mean, we've had conversations about this, haven't we, Charlotte? Because I think when you started out your PhD research, we were talking about resilience, and the intervention, in a way, could be sort of seen as not great in a way, and that it's sort of getting the kids to cope better, and so we've sort of changed the way we sort of presented it. I think it's right to give children the coping skills. I think they will certainly benefit from that, but you can't neglect the system of the school at the same time. And I think in one of our papers, it might be the COVID one, it might be another one, Charlotte, where we have talked about the need for systems and structures to change. And particularly when you're talking about teacher mental health, it's not about signposting them to counselling or, the reason you need to tackle the root causes of teacher mental health. You need to tackle the root cause of children's mental health. And I think that needs a sort of broader discussion, doesn't it? I'm thinking about, the Green Paper came out about transforming children and young people's mental health provision. Psychologists for Social Change said you're not really addressing some of the structural, causes, the root causes, like, with problems with schools being exam factories and putting a lot of pressure and stress on children. So I always sort of like us to sort of think that there is a place for these interventions for children. I think it's right to sort of give them the sort of coping skills, but it needs to be it's just one part of the puzzle, isn't it? I don't know if you've got anything to add to that, Charlotte, but we've come a long way in terms of thinking about this, haven't we?
Yeah, I remember doing a lot of reading, particularly when I suppose we were thinking about sort of the theory underpinning the programme, about the difference between like positioning resilience as sort of an outcome, which would be, you are resilient, you need to build this resilience, which I suppose you've just argued would be maybe people in schools who are saying, oh, children just need to be more resilient. So that would be sort of positioning it as an outcome. But I suppose the angle we've taken is position it as a process. So it's something that, we need to support children in developing through, developing their coping skills, helping them to sort of think about the different challenges they're experiencing. So I suppose there just needs to be a move in that thought process, really, that it's a process. We're all becoming more resilient by, I suppose, the different skills we're developing. So yeah, I think that's sort of the angle we're coming at. And I think more programs need to start looking at within schools.
Yeah, because it is. I reviewed a book proposal recently, which had the title something along the lines of "Resilience in FE," and I just felt desperately uncomfortable about that term because it's a virtuous term in itself, but the way that it kind of tends to be maligned and kind of hijacked. Yeah, so kind of one thought for me is just the extent to which that could be. I don't know if you've already done it, or even if you think it's kind of worthwhile doing, but almost developing almost a bit of more conceptual complexity when it comes to the notion of resilience, because you use the term kind of processual resilience rather than almost a resilience by osmosis, where you just, you just need to kind of, get used to it and kind of harden yourself to it. Yeah,
and I suppose it's not about resilient individuals, is it? Sorry, Charlotte.
Oh, I was just going to say, I hope I've tackled a little bit of that in, the book chapter that we've both written for Janet. My chapter was on emotional wellbeing and resilience, and I do spend probably about a page sort of conceptualizing how resilience can be viewed as sort of a process and outcome, and how to target it within programs. So hopefully that'll go some way in, helping to clarify that conceptualization element.
Yeah, so that's a plug for the book, Charlotte. Is it called Psychology of Education, edited by Janet Lord, and it's out this year?
Yeah, it's coming out quite soon, isn't it?
Yeah, I drew the short straw and had to write the research methods chapter.
Right, well, we're down to the last kind of minute or so. So are there any kind of final questions or comments from other colleagues, just to finish off?
Can I ask a slightly thorny one? That if this is going to take a long time to answer.
We've got a minute. We've got no time left, Dave. Sorry.
Okay.
Yeah, sorry.
Okay.
Which is kind of related, actually, to sort of following up what Craig's asking about. You use the word resilience and coping interchangeably, which kind of prompts for me a jingle jangle question. So I wondered whether that was intentional.
I suppose in the program, I suppose we have in some ways used them interchangeably, but I suppose how I would argue is that developing or supporting coping skills then in turn supports resilience. I don't know if you'd see it differently, Claire, but if you're building your sort of children's coping skills, in turn that's then developing resilience. But
Yeah.
other people might see it slightly differently.
So what's the difference between resilience and coping then?
I suppose I was sort of thinking that, resilience is not just about the individual, is it? I think it goes back to what Craig was saying. It's about resilient schools as well. I suppose it's thinking about all the different influences on the child, and I suppose how they cope is one part and way that we can enhance their resilience, but it's also about having resilient schools, or whatever you want to call them, schools that will nurture children and be positive in terms of their well-being, in terms of negative. I don't know if that's answered your question, but you might know a bit more about coping and resilience than us, Dave.
Well, I'm just interested as to whether you thought the delineation sat. I'll pause at that point, because otherwise, this could get into a long discussion.
I think that's a really good distinction, because for me that makes me think again of the coping. In that sense, makes me think of in a sense, the negative connotations, whereas resilience can actually be reframed as a proactive and constructive and process-based facilitation of, enabling people to make effective transitions rather than just cope in that sense. So anyway, we could go on and on, but time is up. So I just want to thank Claire and Charlotte for brilliant presentation. Excellent, really thought-provoking.
Great way to end the day.
Thank you.
Yeah, so many thanks. It is recorded. I'll send you a copy of the recording before we kind of publish it live. So I'll get that to you within the next couple of days. So thanks also, colleagues, for turning up and contributing to the questions and discussion.
I'll certainly be disseminating this to our secondary programme and our primary programme on their behalf.
Excellent.
Very, very valuable. Can you edit out the bit where I said I'd promoted myself, please, Craig?
No.
Okay. Yeah, no, I'll certainly be sharing that. Really, really good. Really enjoyed it.
Thanks, everybody. Thanks for inviting us.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, thanks a lot.
Okay.
Thank you. Bye now.
Bye.